Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for dialing in to today's Knowledge and Network session. We're really excited to have you here. And in today's recorded event, we're going to be hearing from Steph Colbourn of Edit Audio. Steph is going to introduce themselves shortly. But in the meantime, Steph, give us a wave. Hopefully everybody can see your great green cardigan.
Neon. I don't know why I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt. It's super hot, but here I am.
Well, AC, who knows? Climate control. What can we say? Speaking of intros, if you're not yet a member of the Podcast Academy TPA, we're a 1,000-strong virtual community across the world. If you are not yet a TPA member, welcome to the event. We offer these at least once a month, if not thrice, among our many programs. We do hope you'll join us. TPA members can see all recorded programs of the past as one of the many benefits on our member website. Just go to recorded events, and you will see them all. Just use the Control F to find the keyword and it'll jump you right to the program you want to see. Also, if you haven't heard of them already, we produce the Ambies, which are the Oscars of podcasting. And as a TPA member, you're going to get to participate in our submission and voting process. And I think TPA members get a discounted submission as well. Woohoo. The other thing that today's speaker can attest to is our mentorship program. So Steph is also a mentor, and that's launching this week. I'm sorry to say that we have closed signups and matching, but don't worry if you are new, if you just heard about it, we're going to be doing another round in spring 2024. We'll open up recruitment in January. So you'll be able to be aware of that in our e-newsletter, which you are all going to be signed up to after this if you're not already. And last but not least, if you are going to be in Denver, please find us at booth 607. I will be there at Podcast Movement, and you can sign up for some other cool programs there too. So connect with me on that platform that Podcast Movement has created. Anyway, I'm going to drop the sign up link here if you are not already a TP member, but I recognize so many faces in here already. We'll just move right ahead to thank our partner, the State of Women. They're an organization that champions the stories and issues of all those socialized or identifying as women or femme across the world through conversation, connection, and community. I will drop their website into the chat. Now it's time to hear from the wonderful Steph. So, right. Steph, I'm going to stop screen sharing. This is our survey if you do have to get cut off towards the end, but take it away, Steph. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I am going to share my screen, but first I have to, of course, find the window that I closed, which I don't know how I did that, but I did. So, okay, well, this worked when we tested it, so just give me 1 second.
No worries. I like how you're demonstrating humility as a leader already.
TPA presentation. Here we go. I will always demonstrate humility. Can everyone see this? Or Amanda, can
Looks great.
All right, so I made a little slideshow today. It's very short, and feel free to jump in at any point and ask any questions. But I am Steph. I run a company called Edit Audio. We're a full suite production house. So we make podcasts from beginning to end. We do everything from like research to pitching to booking to post-production, editing, marketing, the whole 9 yards. And we are an entirely remote team. We are entirely owned and operated by women, trans, and non-binary people. I should have said my pronouns are she, they, which means you can feel free to use either of those, or really any pronoun if you say it respectfully. And yeah, this is my lovely team. We're awesome. I started the company in Canada. I moved to New York a little while ago, but we're distributed across Canada, the US, and the UK. Yes. So I wanted to start with this very bleak intro. When you Google the state of the podcast industry, when you just Google like podcast producers, this is what we see, which is just like a bit bleak, I think, because I don't know if we're making content for the world. I mean, this is obviously not a good representation of everyone in the world, and is very much representative of mostly white cis men. So that was something I saw very early. So I went to school for audio production, and I was one of two people in my year who was not a man. And I always think about like, okay, what opportunities would have been open to me, or like how much more confident would I be in my skills? Like what questions would I have not been afraid to ask? Stuff like that when I was going through school. So when I started hiring people, made a pretty big effort to try to do a few things to make sure that I was uh, a good mentor, and also hiring diverse people. So I think sometimes it's hard, like we throw around these words like diversity or inclusion and stuff, and it's often hard to know what that actually means. And it also can mean different things in different contexts. And I think nowadays with social media, we like to like conflate a lot of the words. And I think they begin to lose power at a certain point. But here are some ways that, people can be diverse based on their age, gender, sexual orientation, disability or ability, religion, and socioeconomic standing. So, um, those are things that I always try to be cognizant of. And yes. Do, 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 do. So, this was our goal. And I like to think that this could be a goal for all businesses to, create a workplace and be part of a workplace where everyone can feel seen and heard. And then also that diversity is something that we can celebrate instead of, you know, thinking it's something that we can shun. So, I always like to talk about, hiring different people and having different people working on stories of ours. So when we create like a production, if everyone behind the production came from the same, pocket of diversity, or came from the same background, we would have a less whole story, So everyone's like differences bring something to the table, and I like to celebrate those and see them as strengths rather than things that separate us. A big thing that I have tried to do since starting this company is to look at our hiring practices. So I did a podcast many years ago with someone from McKinsey, and they had done a research study, which I can link, that talks about like barriers to entry just based off gender. So um women especially, and one of the biggest things was that like women wouldn't apply to jobs that they didn't feel qualified for, and men would apply to jobs that they didn't feel qualified for. And a big part of making people feel like they are able to apply is the language that we use in job postings. So something like must have X amount of years of experience to apply can be sometimes discouraging, because, maybe someone would see that and be like, oh, I have 3.5 years, which is almost 4. And another person would say, like, oh, I have 3.5 years. That's not 4. So trying to be a bit more open with language, and encouraging for everyone to apply. Putting your company values into your job application. I think if you have, well, first of all, like working on values at a company is a great exercise to do just to like align everyone, but putting them in job postings makes it clear from the get-go that you care about people, you want them to feel seen, you want them to apply even if they don't fit 100% of the qualifications. And yeah, it helps people like identify that they can belong in the workplace too. Casting a wider net. This is something that I still try to work on a lot. I think it's really hard to know when you're like in a bubble. Um, and so we always try to put our job applications in a bunch of different newsletters, a bunch of different websites, a bunch of different Slack groups, and just get a bigger net going, because often, like our communities are so insular that we might want to reach people, but if we don't have access to anyone in that community, we're not going to get there. So we're trying to cast a wider net just in terms of like who's going to see this application. And then something that I try to do is to be as flexible as I can be with like on and off time and work hours. So that has been made slightly easier, I think, since the pandemic, and remote work is becoming more common. But I also think like just creating a space where people can be like, hey, I need to take a mental health day, or I have to go get my car like oil changed at this time, so I'm going to be off for 2 hours. Whatever it is, just being flexible with that. Sorry. Okay, so that's hiring, but then once you hire, obviously there's a lot that has to happen to keep people. So I think creating a workplace where people feel seen and heard. I think we say that a lot and it might again lose its meaning, but to me it means that, differences aren't ignored, but instead they're like again celebrated. So like, how are people different? How can we support those differences? How can we talk about them, hear about them, and like have you show up as your full self in the workplace? So, you know I'm queer. If I was working for someone, I wouldn't want them to just ignore that I was queer, right? I would want them to be like, oh, that's awesome. Like, tell me about your partner, or whatever. Like, creating an ecosystem where at least I could feel comfortable to show up as a full person rather than coming to work as like only my work self. Um, I think also creating opportunities to train and grow can be really, really hard as a small company. Like, I'm sure a lot of like it's like a lot of scrambling gets like done, and we're like all working multiple roles and like trying to get things done. Um, so trying to look, if you can't make those opportunities exist within your own company, looking outside. So looking to like the TPA or different organizations that can help support training opportunities or growth opportunities, or talking to people about their trajectory and where they want to go. Um, because that also is important. Um, and then recognizing and acknowledging areas you need to do better. I think this is a huge part of being a good person, but also a good leader or mentor. Like the ability to self reflect and realize you're not perfect and admit that. I don't think that was like very common, prior to a few years ago. I think it was like you should show up as a leader and be like this perfect like robot. But that's obviously not feasible. So I think being as like humble as you can about your own mess ups is great. And then holding ourselves accountable, which, it's one thing to be able to say like, yeah, I screwed up. But it's another thing to be like, how are we not going to do this again? Or how are we actively changing? So, one thing that I found really helpful that we do, and I'm just going to pause for water, is that a few years ago we created like a edit audio commitment to change, and this is just an internal doc that anyone who wants to on my team can be a part of. We check in monthly, and we have like, I don't know, there's probably 50 bullet items on it, and we focus on different ones every month. So I mean, you can see different ones here, like recognizing, empathizing that we live in a time of crisis, blah 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 blah. Yeah, giving staff members space to acknowledge when episodes are potentially triggering and trying to shift work away from them, having continuous check-ins. Some things are like mental health days. We have a bunch of different things that we're doing to try to make our team more healthy. And so we're identifying things that we can do, things that we have done, and things that we can do better. And when we highlight them in green, it means that that's something that's happening, right away. So like within the next month before we meet again. And yellow is something that is like a little less tangible. So maybe like happening over the next 3 months or ongoing. And if anyone wants to go through those later, I'm happy to share some of them. And then this one is, how can the industry hold us accountable? So I don't know if people know about the Equality in Audio Pact. It was started in 2020 as a way to hold production houses and people in the podcast industry accountable. And it sort of lost traction, mainly because it was a lot of work and the people organizing it did not have the bandwidth anymore. And so a bunch of us are revitalizing it and taking that on. So Emriel is leading it in the UK with Laura Blake. And then I'm the North America chapter. And regardless of where you are, there's a chapter head for each continent, kind of area of the world. And so we will be looking to get people on board with that. And if you wanted to, you could, sign the pledge, and then you'll get, notifications from us once we are organized or more organized. But I really encourage everyone to do that. And if you're part of a larger organization or company and you'd want them to get involved, feel free to reach out to me and I can reach out on your behalf. Empathetic leadership. This is something that I try to do all the time. Get to know people on my team, tell them what I care about them, tell them when they do something awesome, try to educate myself more about things that are going on, in their lives, and also just how I can be better and ask a bunch of questions. So I think often we're afraid to ask questions, but if you are not sure, like, I think a really easy example, like someone's pronouns, you're not sure like how to use they them pronouns. I think there's an amount of work that you can do to educate yourself just through Googling or talking to other people in your life. And then after you do that work, if you're still unsure or unclear or not sure how it relates to a specific person, I think everyone loves to be asked a question before we just assume something. So ask people questions, do it respectfully, tell them that you're coming from a place of care. And I think that always helps. And I think this is really important. This is like not like a checklist, like I know I showed a checklist earlier of things that we're doing, but that checklist is meant to hold us accountable, and it's something that we're checking in on regularly. And I think this whole process of like being a kind leader or mentor is a lifelong practice. It's something that's checked in on, it's something that you have to come back to. I think that like at the core of it, there's like you need to be able to like self-assess, you need to be curious, and you need to be empathetic towards people. And I think at the end of the day, this sounds a bit salesy, but diversity does drive, engagement. It makes people on your team more excited and more productive to be at work. And it also leads to really good content and innovative approaches to things, right? Like the more voices in a room from that have different perspectives, the more you have to think about, and the more that we can all create beautiful things together. And that is all. Well, I will take any questions or anything.
Thank you so much, Steph. Easy peasy, right? This is just effortless, right?
So easy. I mean, I usually get like scared about talking about stuff like this. I'm just looking, I'm going to stop my screen share. But I get like a little nervous talking about stuff like this. I think everyone does, because there's no like expert, like I'm not an expert. I'm just trying. But I think that's part of this whole thing, is like some people would consider themselves an expert with the same amount of experience or, skills as me. So I'm very
I
happy to be
appreciate
here.
that. Well, I'm a little worried when somebody says they're an expert and they've figured all of this out. That doesn't sound like an achievable goal. It's about kind of maybe how you respond in the moment when you make a mistake. That's where you are proving if you are a trustworthy, humble leader or not. And I think that's very hard because we are all humans. But I don't want to take up a lot of space here. I bet there's a lot of questions on top of mind. And I also understand how vulnerable this conversation makes us. So what I'm going to invite folks to do, if they prefer not to come on camera and ask a question, you are welcome to raise your hand and ask a question on air, or you can type it into the chat and I'm happy to read it aloud. This is totally fine. You can send the question to me if you'd like to just remain anonymous. I understand that there's a lot of people who are supervisors themselves and just don't want to put themselves in an awkward situation, but please send questions because this is a really important chat.
I also saw something in the chat when I was speaking about like the standardization of different language in the industry. I know there's podcast taxonomy, which thank you for linking to, and recently Sounds Profitable released another let me find it another like list of like words and stuff that we're using in the industry um to help. So I'm gonna find that.
Yeah, I
And
appreciate
send it
that
to you.
questions as well, because that's another barrier is jargon. Jargon is used to kind of signal expertise and authority, but it also can really block out people who may not realize, for example, they have transferable skills, that what they've been doing is actually this thing, but nobody flagged it to them. And that is why, for example, having a mentor who looks out and says, you just iterated, you should be a tech project leader, even though, that's obviously not what we're doing here, but where is it?
Yeah, which happens to me all the time. I mean, I just started seeing this like business advisor to help with like businessy things. And I was talking to her and she would, use the word director or like manager. And I'd be like, well, what's the difference between like what and is it tangible and is it per role,
Mm.
and I think we've had lots of conversations about that, and it's just like I don't know what those words mean. Like they don't mean anything to me, so it depends on where you're coming from and what you're looking for too. I just posted the link, by the way. That's like
Oh, that's great.
they made a new glossary for more ad specific things, but still think it's worth looking at.
I really appreciate that. And I feel like that could be integrated into an onboarding just because you might bring somebody great onto the team and they may or may not be feeling, comfortable enough to share. I don't actually know what that word means. And that can also be really hard to navigate as a new person.
Oh
Great
yeah.
question just sent to me. Steph, how you feeling about fielding your first question? And big shout out to that person.
Great. I love
All right.
questions.
Well, this is a deep one. I love this question. How do you create a space of vulnerability? Some folks have had bosses that take people's personal lives and sort of weaponize them, or maybe consciously or unconsciously kind of hold it against them or keep that in the back of the mind. And this is probably something everybody in the space has kind of had top of mind at some point. It's a really anxiety provoking thing. I shared this private thing about myself, and now it's going to be on that person's mind. And it's going to be used to contextualize any future interactions I have with that person. So, are there any advice? Tips or tricks that you have to kind of mitigate that, or for leaders to keep in mind as they understand they're going to be privy to a lot of private, vulnerable things? How do you maybe make that space and support your staff in a diversity of things?
I think it's different to give advice to a leader than it is to give advice to someone working for someone. So first I want to like address that. Like if you are working at a company and you don't feel like there's the space to be vulnerable, don't be. Like that is like your sole priority should be like keeping yourself safe and keeping, you know, like sometimes you have to keep work separate from personal things if you're not in a space that allows for it. And that sucks, but is true. And so I think my advice to that person would be to like keep themselves safe and find community either within the company that feels safe to be that person or to show up as your full self. And if that's not available within the company, to find it outside of it at like, you know, different online groups or the TPA, or asking your company to send you to more events so that you can network with people, and finding that like safe place to be yourself within different groups of people. I think as a leader, um, first of all, the idea of like weaponizing anything should feel scary. I think, often people's vulnerability. I mean, I think the easiest example of this is like with, sick leave. So, like someone who needs a week off for personal reasons, and then you feel like that will, like, if I need a week off because of something that happened in my life, I'm scared to tell you that because then that's going to be used against me, because really it's not over in a week. I'm still dealing with it and I might be a little less present at work, but you know, that is part of it. And I think if you feel that that's getting, like, if you feel as a leader that that should be a weapon or like weaponized, that is a sign that you could work on having a bit more empathy. And I think also recognizing that like we're all human at the end of the day, including ourselves. And sometimes there are periods where people are more or less productive, but that doesn't mean they're a better or worse employee. Right? Like productivity is only one metric to look at when you're like looking at the health of your team. But in addition to that, like just because someone's very productive one week and not the next does not mean that overall over the whole like 6 years that they're with you, they're like productive or unproductive, right? So you have to like I think just recognize we're all human and we all have shit. Um, and we have to, look beyond that. I don't know a single leader that hasn't taken time off or hasn't, and I say that as someone who's terrible at taking time off, but hasn't taken like time off or had personal things come up. And actually, like on that note, taking time off is a very responsible thing to do because I'm sure we've all worked when we were not mentally totally there. And I don't know if that's better, honestly. So I think just understanding that, like, and looking at yourself and being like, I wasn't, I needed to take this time off before, I need to do this before I can empathize with this person who also needs to. Um, yeah, I don't know. I hope that's a good tip. Honestly, sometimes having like a list of like things to like look at, like am I being empathetic, am I looking at this person like as a person, would I treat myself the same, is a good metric. Or what would I tell my best friend if they told me this, is a good tip.
Yeah, I like that, Steph. I think that being vulnerable and also explain that you don't know all the answers and willing to make it right even if you make a mistake is really important. I hear a lot about empathy, and please keep your questions coming. I don't want to be the only one asking questions, but I'm fine to like parrot them if you send them to me DM, folks. I think, oh, we do have a question, a hand raised. Fantastic. Stephanie, would you like to come on mic, or you can type it in there and I'm happy to recite it? Two Stephs talking. I love it.
Cool.
Hi.
Hi.
So I think the question I would have too with the empathetic leadership, I don't have a team that I work with, but like I would like work with an editor, like to help me get my episodes together. But I feel just like in leadership, um, how do you balance being empathetic versus like, okay, girl, get it together, kind of thing, like because I feel like there is that balance of just like like by when you like open yourself up to like, hey, I'm here for you, then people they can like bring all of that to you. And then it's
Oh
like, but you
yeah,
still have a business to run. So like, is there some type of check and balance that you have?
I think that's an extremely good question. I don't know. I mean, the different like leadership people that I talk to, we always talk about this because there's the idea that also like you opening yourself up as someone who's in charge, you
Mhm.
know, that makes you more like um easy to like walk on kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I think it's hard to find that balance. I think I always try to just be very upfront with those. Like I think I'm a pretty like upfront person, so I'll say like, "Hey, I think that like this is I'm so sorry you're going through this. Like lead with empathy. Like I'm sorry this happened, blah 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 blah." Like, empathize with them and be like, "But this is the deadline or this is the thing. What
Mhm.
can you do?" And I like to put it in the other person's hands. Like you tell me what's possible cuz like you know, you're enforcing your limit or you're stating your limit and it's up to them to meet you. If they don't want to meet you, they're not going to. And oftentimes people if they can't, like let's say you're like, okay, the deadline's Friday, someone's cat died and they can't make the deadline on Friday, I would obviously lead with like, I'm so sorry to hear about your cat. Like, I hope you're able to get some rest and blah, blah, blah. Let me know if there's anything I can do. I do really need this episode for Friday. If you can't get it to me, please let me know so that I can like make other plans and let me know by this date. Again, like really feel for you, so sorry. And then that's up to that person. Like you don't know everything that's going on in that person's life, right? And you can't ever know that.
Yeah.
But being like, I'm here for you, I'm so sorry, this is my like, this is my limit, and then they can decide where they fall within that. If they want to say, I can't do it for Friday, you say, all right, cool. Can you, they can say, I can do it for Saturday morning. Does that work? Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but it's up to you to have that conversation. And it also like opens the door for a conversation rather than like being like, yeah, like get it together.
Right.
But it does happen. I mean, sometimes people like, I don't know, but I do think putting the power in the other person's hands to make the decision often helps, because they might not realize that you need it for Friday, right? Or they might not realize that like you have other options of people that could be helping you. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks for chatting.
I want Steph as a
Saying
boss.
get it together. Saying
Thank
get
you
it
for
together
that.
is one on the empathetic leadership checklist.
Yeah.
Maybe
And
we should all workshop together on that. I think there's probably something that we could create.
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that great question. Does anybody else have any questions or comments or tips or tricks? I wanted to continue along this really good discussion. We're doing really well on time, and then we will break out and just have a little chat about what works, what doesn't, what challenges are you working through. Feel free to send the question through me directly. You can send them to me or Steph directly. That's totally fine. I think, one thing that you learn as a leader, we have another good question, is going to be discussed by JP. JP, please feel free to come on air and ask your question.
Ooh, I love that my shirt matches your wall.
Hey, Steph. How are you? Good to see you.
Nice
So I
to
have a
see you.
question about your take as a leader, innovator, groundbreaking around queer podcasting and queer-owned podcast companies. Are there recommendations you would make for folks on the call and to others who are going to ultimately watch the video of resources if they have queer employees or queer podcasts that they're producing, like resources that you would direct them to? A, and then B, if there aren't enough of them, what would be your take on what should be created? Hint, hint, TPA.
Yes. Would love to help work with anyone to create those. I also think there's two things I want to say to this, because they're two different situations. Like, one is being an employer of people, and the other is being a person that creates content. So if you're creating content that involves queer narratives, queer stories, queer people, queer anything, there are tons of resources by like huge organizations like GLAAD, and people would be, I mean, you can email me if you want. I'm not like as big of an expert, but like there are organizations to like fact check you and make sure you're providing the right information and using the right language. And I think similar, if you're working on any sort of sensitive story, like I think this is often done if like content warnings really well. Like if you're talking about suicide, there is language that you should be using in your content to make sure that you're addressing it correctly. I think if you're not part of any community, and even if you are, it's good to like look at those and just like re-up your knowledge. The second part of that is being a leader of queer people, which is interesting because it's also like, I think, illegal to ask people their like sexual orientation if you're an employer, but creating a good workplace for everyone should be the like top line. And I think there are I actually don't know if there's I think there are resources. I know that Jack in Canada had one, but I'm not sure in the US the resources people could use. Do you know, JP? I guess they're like an employer, like how to be a good employer to LGBTQ people.
Yes, actually, there's a
Human Rights Campaign?
HRC
Yeah.
has a great it's like a index that they use to say, are you doing, if you have all these policies in place, then you can be like considered, like have a score of like inclusion around LGBTQ inclusion. Not everybody, I think, goes into trying to get the like the certificate or whatever, but it does provide a really great like touchstone for
Yes.
folks that you could implement, because I think a lot of those are like for big companies that have those resources, but if you're a small company, they're a really good resource to but those are like, you have employees that are in an office and like,
Yeah.
HR policies and whatnot. And I feel like podcasters have a kind of different type of company set up, either they're one, a solo operation, or they have maybe, 10 or 12 employees. And so that's something that I don't know if there's a lot of like podcast company tailored queer resources that
I
I'm
did
not
just
quite
drop
sure.
the link to the index. So if anyone wants to check that out. But there's also I'm part of the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, which is in the States. I like to call it the gay agenda as a joke. But it is the NGLCC, and there are a bunch of small companies, a bunch of independents, and a bunch of huge organizations like banks and stuff that all are part of it, and they have networking sessions and mentorship sessions and all kinds of stuff. So, and you can also apply to get like certified through them as like a registered business. But I would recommend, like, regardless of the size of the company, to be a part of that because it's just good for getting information.
These are just such great resources. JP, I love this question. And I also love that invitation and call to continue building these things. I think we also notice, I hear this in spaces stuff. We have time for one more question if anybody wants to keep them coming, but I'll pose one in case nobody raises their hand or sends me anything. We notice a lot of, say, discomfort in our spaces. I used to do a lot of work doing a lot of sexual harassment prevention trainings, and also that's very adjacent to and inclusive of other, intersections of identity, because the less seen, heard, appreciated, admired, and celebrated you are, certainly the to in those domains and beyond. So I think we notice there's generational differences, there's education differences, there are lived experience differences, and then there's obviously gender differences. And I love how, Steph, you named that there is certainly, as you create content, it's going to impact the people who are listening to those voices. So, and this is a big one where I used to do gender-based violence prevention education. Don't also forget that the people in that work are themselves impacted by it. So if you're doing a true crime podcast or one that talks about somebody having an upsetting experience, I like to call it universal precautions, right? Like, don't even have to ask that person. Just assume that this is possibly going to impact them in some way. And so, Steph, tell me how you support, or what care resources or what accommodations, in addition to the kindness that you shared, say that person grieving their cat, which would mean a lot to me.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I appreciate you
personal.
naming that. What accommodations or what ways can you make your team not feel like they have to share something deeply personal that they and you may not be ready and have space to discuss? Like, how have you set up those systems and structures?
So part of that checklist that I showed the top of, there are like, moving people off of work if they're especially close to it, or it's during especially, traumatic time. So like during 2020 with George Floyd, we were working on this huge news project. We had like daily news briefings that we were working on across the US, and it was extremely hard. Like, it was a hard time, and we hired contractors who were not people of color to work on them during that time because it was too much. So I think recognizing when it's too much and asking people if it is, and like, don't be afraid to ask. I think people really appreciate when you can notice that something would be impacting them more than you. And that just is true. And then I think also there's a lot of like, self-care again. Like, I hate these words because they're so like diversity and self-care. Like, I get it. I'm also like, oh, cringe. But it's like meaningful. I think creating systems within your company or team where you can get self-care and where they're like pre-planned. So when we worked on a true crime series, the first time that we worked on it, we were less good about this. To be fair, it did happen over the pandemic, and it was like very like it took us 2 years to finish producing this because there was like travel restrictions and a bunch of stuff. So that was part of it. But the second time we did like a hyper intensive week and a half of recording on location. And that was really intense, right? Like we're meeting up with people who are directly impacted by someone's death, murder, like it's intense. And I think we built in moments of self-care, like forced self-care, and we identified which interviews would be the hardest for each of us emotionally, and we built in time after the fact to do things that we deemed healing. So we did like things that I like to point to are like group activities, so interacting with people, similarly getting alone time when you need it. Food is important, food and hydration, and then moving your body. So those are the things that make me feel good. Those are the things that I try to encourage my team to do. So I remember after one particularly rough interview, we all decided to drive to a nearby lake and put our toes in the water and, sit, and some of us read and some of us swam. And, we just did that. It was the middle of the workday. We took the whole afternoon off and did that. The next day we had like a check-in in the morning to see how everyone was doing. So I think planned moments of self-care are really, really important. There's like and this moment here where I'm going to say, like, if you are the person who's leading the team, modeling that is the most important thing that I have realized. So I remember when I first started growing my team, I'm very heavily therapized. So I go to therapy every week. I'm like, have always done this, like, well, not always, but for a while. And I would be like, oh, I have, I would put in my calendar to take that hour off. But then I realized like other people on my team were going to therapy, but they were like embarrassed maybe to talk about it or to say that. So I was like, oh, okay. And so I just started putting my status as getting therapized on Slack. So everyone knows my calendar's open. I'm getting therapized. I use the like massage emoji where it looks like someone is like taking over the person's brain. And it makes it like fun and like easy and whatever. So now other people can be like, oh, I'm in therapy from 1 to 2. And like after you do that consistently, people end up also feeling safe to do that.
Yeah.
Similarly, we have like a self-care channel, which I think was especially important at the beginning of the pandemic. But I would be like, I'm going for a walk. Bye-bye. And like go on a walk. And then other people would be like, oh, I'm going to go on a walk. Like, and like start seeing that they could do that too.
Yeah.
You also have to be supportive when then they do things like that, though. You can't be like, I'm going on a walk, and then when someone else goes on a walk, be like,
where are you? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I just, Steph, I don't want to cut you off. You have so many amazing tips and tricks. And I think it really is a conversation. It's a learning experience. I imagine anybody watching this on demand might be like, that's not really my style, or this sounds like a lot of therapy, or this just isn't my culture. And I want to name that, because it really comes to knowing who you are as a leader. And I think that the themes I'm hearing, just to bring us into the final step of this, is consistency, clarity, communication. Those are really important. They are a lot of work. If I've noticed the highest success rate of a team that is healthy is when there is a very clear, very continued cadence of conversation. Lots of alliteration there, excuse me. I think we're moving into a space where we're realizing that if we want to have healthy teams, we cannot lead them as they were led 20 years ago. It's just not relevant to the here and now. Teams don't look or operate the same way. We're not having the same market. We don't have the same tools and tech. Nobody works the same way they did in the 80s. So if we are leaning on all those old learning and development principles about a leader is this, and this is the only way to lead, and this is the language you use, and this is what professionalism look like, then it's just gonna fail. And I love how you open, Steph, by saying, truly, these are going to help your business grow. going to get better, more innovative ideas. You're going to have less trouble keeping talent. You're going to have less new opportunities. So I could talk all day about this, but I'd like to continue this conversation on Slack. So I'm going to post into general, and I'm going to ask people to share their tips and tricks. Steph, I want to thank you so much for just being vulnerable, showing us your leadership style. It's going to look and feel differently. The last thing I'll say is that it's truly, I think, graciousness, giving grace to yourself and to your team is going to be a real game changer. That's not something I see a lot in these thought leadership things on how to lead a team. But I think that as a leader, we can model that by apologizing. If we make a mistake easily, not making it about ourselves or comforting others. I've seen that as a really good tip. And then one last quick tip, Steph, before I put people into breakouts, just meet and greet each other and maybe share one tip and trick with each other.
I just was reading the chat, and I also have a trauma reporting certification that if anyone's interested in getting, I can send that your way as well. It's just like a training that I did over like
Oh
a
my
week,
gosh.
or you could do it in a day, up to you. But this was so great, and thank you. And yeah, I really I don't think that there's like one right way to be a good mentor or leader. I just think that it's important to hear more perspectives on it, because again, we've been traditionally told over and over again there's this one way of doing it, and that's just not working anymore.
It sure as heck ain't. I am super pumped to have y'all meet each other. I do want mentors. I thank you so much for being here. I see a lot of you in here. Your leadership style is going to be distinct to you, and you're not a supervisor. It's really more of a balance of powers, but there's a lot of good nuggets that Steph shared. So I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. Please chit chat, introduce yourselves, and then maybe share one tip or trick. Make it pithy because we have about 7 minutes, and they'll bring us all back to wrap. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for being here in today's talk. Again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. There is no real formula. If there were, we would have figured it out already, but life is not like that. So life instead is complex, diverse, dynamic, and fun, and beautiful, and challenging. And that is why we are here. Thank you so much, Steph, for being here. We hope, in fact, on the other side of things, to talk about how you can maybe leverage some of these tools to remove some of the pressure off of your team so that you can focus all that emotional and other energy on supporting the human beings. This talk is led by TPA member John Gaunt. It will happen on August 7th, and it will also be recorded and visible within a couple of business days of its taking place on the TPA member website under recorded events. So folks, I'm going to stop recording, and I just want to thank y'all again. Thank you, Steph. Big round of applause to you. You've been great.